Frank Master Moreau, and I freaking love comics.
Yo, my name is Donnie Cates, and I know the brand is I freaking love comics, but I fucking love comics.
I'm Marjorie Liu, and I freaking love comics.
Hello, I'm Chris Claremont, and I freaking love freaking comics. You got a problem with that?
I'm Todd Bernardi, creator of Kukui Project and Disco Thunder Groove Bone, and I freaking love comics.
Comics, movies, TV, video games, anime, your powers combined. I freaking love comics.
Live, Vegeta, and Burger.
Hello, IFLC. This is Judah Rad, and today we have a very, very special guest. I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Arlen Schumer, a member of the Society of Illustrators, creating comic book style art for advertising and editorial markets. He is a recognized expert on American pop culture. His comic book art history book, The Silver Age of Comics Art, won the Independent Book Publisher Awards for Best Popular Culture Book. His other books are Visions from the Twilight Zone and the Neil Adams Sketchbook. And Arlen, I'm very excited to have you on the program today. I guess I'd like to start off with, would you say it would be accurate to say that you freaking love comics?
I might freaking love comics more than the two of you put together, you know.
Right on.
You bet your match, 007. But yeah, when I first discovered you on Facebook only a couple days ago, I was like, you freaking love comics. I love comics. So it's great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh yeah, we're grateful to have you on here. So Arlen, let me ask you, what first piqued your interest about the comic book medium, and kind of give me a little bit of an overview of your journey to becoming the comic guru that you are today.
Comic guru, I like that. You know, I learned how to read from comics before I learned how to read. One of my very first visual images that I can recall in my life was I was in summer camp. I had to be 5.5 years old. My mother was a widow. My father died when I was 4 months old. So she sent me and my older brother to summer sleepaway camp when we were very young. And in those days, comic books were strewn all over the bunks. And most of them were superhero comics. This was in the early 60s, Marvel and DC. And the very first comic I can recall was a Superman annual cover by the baby boomer Superman artist Curt Swan. And in those days, they didn't even publicize who the artist was. But I remember that image, and you know, I fell in love with superheroes because of comics in summer camp. And this was even before I again learned how to read. But I remember staring at a Superman on one of those annuals. And I remember the story. He lost his powers and he had to come up with a new identity. And he came up with Omnipotence Man. Now, this is one of the great things about comics. They were written for kids, but they weren't written down to kids. I mean, the word omnipotence, and I remember looking at this long word and in my mind going, omnipotence. You know, we didn't know. So that's the beauty of comics, is that my whole adult vocabulary comes from comics. And I'm sure I speak for so many other people that grew up reading comics or looking at comics before they learned how to read, is that it taught me everything I know about art and everything I know about writing, pretty much. And it made me want to become an artist because, you know, you start drawing from the comics. My older brother was also artistic, and I just always knew I was going to be an artist, and I always loved comics. And of course, as I got older and I looked back and kind of psychoanalyzed, I found my father figures, my surrogate father figures, in the superheroes. I mean, Superman, Batman, teaching you right from wrong, teaching good from evil, teaching you when to stand up and fight for what you believe is right. I didn't learn that traditionally. I learned that in the comics from my surrogate father figures. And, you know, you combine all those elements, the artistic journey, the philosophical journey, the fact that comics were incredible in the 1960s. You had the whole Marvel explosion. You had DC Comics. You had these great artists. And all those artists that we began to know their works and know their names, Carmine Infantino, Gil Kane, Murphy Anderson, Jack Kirby, Jim Steranko, Neil Adams. I mean, if you had told me when I was 12 years old, at the peak of Neil Adams' emergence, when he was blowing everybody's minds with his photorealistic style, if you had told the 12-year-old me that, Arlen, one day you will be working for Neil Adams, you'll be penciling for him and he'll be inking you, I would have had an adolescent 12-year-old heart attack right there, because he was one of the twin gods of comics. Him and Jim Steranko in the late 60s, they were the gods of comic art.
So
and
let me ask you. So Neil Adams, you talk about working for Neil Adams. What's he like?
Where do I begin? You know, Bob Dylan just put out a song called I Contain Multitudes, which comes from the famous Walt Whitman poem, I Am Large, I Contain Multitudes. And that is usually meant that we're all pretty complex people. We all contain multitudes. Neil Adams is sort of like that. You know, he's a little bit of a lot of things. He's a father figure. He's a great father himself, a great provider. He's obviously one of the great comic artists of all time. He's a natural teacher. I mean, I worked for him for only 2 years after I got out of art school, Rhode Island School of Design, but it was like going to graduate school and getting paid for it. And he taught by example. He taught not traditionally. He taught through criticism. So, and this was mostly when I was with him in the mid 80s, we were doing advertising art, storyboards, animatics, which are like crude animated storyboards.
So like tough love, you're saying he was kind of a harsh teacher.
And you know what? You'll learn a lot that way, because many of us have been too coddled by teachers. But when you get a teacher that teaches through criticism, meaning if I did a drawing, or any of us in the studio did a drawing for advertising, whatever we were doing, and let's say we spent a lot of time on the drawing, but we knew that one little corner we screwed up on, but the rest of it was great. You'd show it to Neil before he would ink it to keep it in his style. Like a laser beam, he would go right to that area where you screwed up and point it out. And that's how you learn. And like I said, my drawing improved, I would say 400% in those 2 years working for him. And the lessons I learned from him, I've kept my whole life, because when you get to work for your childhood idol, I always knew when I would be done with Neil, I'd be ready to be on my own. And that's exactly what happened.
Do you still hear Neil's voice in your head when you're drawing? Like, hey, what are you doing there?
You know, in a way, I mean, because he was such a great teacher like that, I would say as I'm drawing, I remember the lessons that I learned from him about observation, about inking, you know, subtle things that, again, because he didn't teach traditionally, you had to just observe and always be on your toes and pick up things. But it was really, above all, his standards were so high, because those were the standards he set for himself. That's why when you look back on his incredible artwork, it's so brilliant, because he was getting paid literally craft and yet turning out these pages that were works of art. So he wasn't doing it for the money. And those standards stayed with me when I went out to freelance on my own. It's both positive and negative, because when you go to work with other people, when your standards are set that high, and then you go to work with other people who didn't work for Neil Adams and their standards are down here, it makes it very difficult to work together.
You schmucks, do you even know Neil Adams? Come on.
But you know what I mean? It's like when you work for somebody that great and you've got to work up to their standards, it's hard to go back to working with regular people. Now, present company excluded, of course.
Of course. That era to me, you know, and you know, I was born in 1987, so that's like very much my father's era of art. But I've read a lot from it, as you know, this huge canon of comics. You know, you have to do a lot of back reading to really understand and be able to follow, especially with the superheroes.
Yeah.
But that 60s era, I look at that, and the guys that really stand out to me are Jack Kirby and Steranko.
Yeah.
And it's very much a product of the time. Like when I think of the 60s, I think of the tie-dye, the psychedelic, free love, acid trips. And I feel like I see a lot of that in Jack Kirby and Steranko's kind of wacky, very unique art. Would you say that the...
Yeah, absolutely Steranko. I mean, because he came in at the tail end of the 60s and brought in psychedelia and surrealism and everything. I make it a point in my lectures and webinars to point out that at the height of psychedelia, 1968, when the artist Peter Max in the mainstream world was doing his psychedelic art, which is what lay people associate with the psychedelic era, the very same year, Steranko was doing his psychedelic
Nick Fury.
Fury Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. So, you know, that's what I point out in my lectures. The one I'm going to be doing Wednesday night on the relationship between fine art and comic book art, I'm going to be pointing out those parallels. Neil Adams also was doing some kind of psychedelic layouts at the same time that the underground artists like Robert Crumb were dropping acid and doing their psychedelic layouts. So I've always wanted to elevate comic book art up with the rest of the mainstream culture, because lay people that know about mainstream culture, they know Peter Max and psychedelia, but they don't realize that comics were doing it as well. And in fact, when I show the artist Steve Ditko, who created Doctor Strange, his art seeds psychedelia by 3 or 4 or 5 years. And practically every psychedelic artist in San Francisco in the late 60s that was doing all those psychedelic rock posters, every one of them was reading Doctor Strange. Ditko's dimensional worlds that I'll point out in my webinar were psychedelia ahead of their time. But Steve Ditko wasn't dropping acid. He was an old school artist. They were all older men at that time, you know, didn't drink, didn't do drugs, but their art, Ditko's otherworldly dimensions for Doctor Strange were absolutely psychedelic, but ahead of psychedelia.
So let me ask you, I'm going to ask you to tell me a story now. The story begins at the dawn of the golden age of comics. And I think it'd be really interesting for our viewers and me to kind of get an idea of where the golden age started, where it ended, and then how the Silver Age came to be, and ultimately how the Silver Age ended. Do you think you could shed some light on that for us, please?
How much you're going to pay me to do that? That's a tough one. Okay, 1938. Literally, how many years is that from today? That's
like a million years, I think.
82 years ago, I think. This month, the golden age of comics began with the birth of Superman in Action Comics #1. It came out in April of 1938. Even though it's dated June, comics were always 2 months before.
So that's the no shit. So Action Comics 1 is no shit the definitive beginning of the golden age of comics.
Well, even though Superman had his precedents, things like Doc Savage, the hero from the Hulk, you know, various things. The Phantom was a costume character before. But Superman appearing in this brand new medium of the comic book, which was only 5 years old at that time, and was only doing original material for a couple of years after they were reprinting newspaper strips. But Superman, first superhero to hit in comic books, and it was this brand new medium that was selling and it sold, it was an overnight success, selling whatever in millions of copies, and it jump-started. It jump-started an industry, an art form, an archetype. There'd be no Batman without Superman, because young Bob Kane was looking at the money that Siegel and Schuster were making by the end of 1938. And Bob Kane was a struggling young artist, like all the young comic artists were. And he said to the editor of DC Comics, Vince Sullivan, how do I make that money? And Vince Sullivan said, come up with your own superhero. So he went home that weekend with his writing partner, Bill Finger, and the rest is history. They came up with Batman. So,
okay.
And like I said, Wonder Woman, the female icon superhero heroine.
So what was the reaction?
Also, yeah.
What was the reaction here? Was it like Pokemon? Was it like every kid had to have one? All the kids were talking about it at school, and it was the hottest thing since sliced bread at the time, or?
You know, I don't want to pretend I'm any kind of an expert in the golden age. You know, my specialty is really the silver age. But from you know, what is received wisdom is that Superman was literally an overnight success and sold so incredibly well that literally it jump-started a whole industry. Other publishers who were publishing pulps, they switched to comics. You know, Will Eisner got his start before he did The Spirit. He character who was a knockoff called Wonder Man of Superman, and DC Comics sued Wonder Man, and that's why he ended up doing The Spirit. So, you know, without Superman, there'd be no Batman, there'd be no Captain America, there'd be no Wonder Woman, there'd be no superheroes really. And so that's what began the golden age.
So here's a question. So the golden age, eventually it ended. And I'm not, you know, but I don't really know. You'll tell us, I guess, when it had ended. Yes. And then there's almost like a blank period. There's a period between the golden age and the silver age. What exactly happened, and why is there this gap of time between these two ages of comics?
Okay. So after World War II ended, the superheroes were fighting World War II by proxy. On their comic book covers, they became proxy American soldiers. Basically.
You got Captain America knocked out the Fuhrer.
Of course.
Yeah.
Punching Hitler. You've got all these covers. You've got all these patriotic heroes. But then, after the war, the superheroes fell in popularity because without the war, they kind of lost their way. And at the same time, other genres in comics began to become more popular. Westerns, crime comics, eventually horror comics, the famous EC comics, which, by the way, parallels what was happening in Hollywood with movies with the growth of film noir. If you look at movies in the late 40s, post-war, you've got the switch to crime dramas and stories like that. So comics and film both started around the same time. They kind of mimicked each other. By 1950, all the superheroes have basically died out, and the comics publishers switched. Only you know, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman basically remain. And then in the beginning of the 50s, you get the birth of EC Comics, which eventually, you would know the title Mad Magazine started out as Mad Comics, but their genres were science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime comics, and they were super successful. But then in the early 50s, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wertham wrote this infamous book called Seduction of the Innocent, claiming that comics caused juvenile delinquency. And there was a whole, you know, you've grown up in the modern era of parents protesting, you know, liberal programs and things like that. Well, the original pop culture protest was about comic books. This predates the rock and roll era by a couple of years.
And you know, I might be a juvenile delinquent, but I don't think it's because of the comics. So that's
exactly. Yeah, all wrong. But he was so successful that it literally killed the industry overnight. So there were no superheroes except for Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. And, you know, the crime comics, the horror comics died out. So the publishers by the mid-50s were looking for something new. And somebody up at DC Comics, nobody knows who it is, said, hey, why don't we take one of our old mothballed superheroes from the 40s? They chose The Flash, who hadn't been published since 1951. Now, it might seem like, oh, that was only 4 or 5 years ago. Well, in those days, 4 or 5 years was an eternity because to them, only kids read comics. So there was a turnover every 5 years with a new audience. They thought basically nobody's going to. But the key thing was they brought the Flash back in 1956
without the helmet.
Character, a brand new character. Now, in modern parlance, we know the word reboot. The recreation of the Flash in 1956 is probably the first example of a reboot in American pop culture because it kept the name of the Flash, kept the powers, but had a whole new identity and had a whole new look. And since comics are so visual, that visual icon is what now the Flash wasn't literally an overnight success either. It took a couple of years for him to get his own title again in 1959. But by that time, so when we look back, and by the way, the Silver Age was not coined until the mid 60s because a letter writer writing into Justice League of America, the most popular DC Comics title, which reunited all these rebooted 1940s superheroes, some kid wrote in and said, you know, we should call this era the Silver 60s after the golden age of comics, which was, again, from about 1938 to about 1950. So when we look back, you asked, what were those years in between? It's only been about the last 10 or 20 years that various comic historians have started referring to those early 50s as the atomic age. And it's probably the best phrase because of the alliteration. It was the atomic bomb era. And there weren't superheroes. It wasn't the Silver Age. So it was this like 5 or 6 year gap. But again, there were funny animal comics, humor, romance.
What's interesting,
comics, lots of genres.
Kind of an amusing, I guess, side anecdote to that period is you did have the all winners squad. It was Captain America and some early timely heroes that were fighting.
That was their version of
the Korean War or something.
Right.
Right.
Well, no. Well, okay. So now what you're talking about is right before the Flash was created in 56. What was known as Marvel Comics back then was still called Timely, or maybe they were called Atlas by that time.
Yeah.
But they tried in 1955, a year before the Flash, they tried bringing back Captain America and Submariner as commie smashers. This is in the heyday of the Red Scare, McCarthyism. But the difference is, unlike the Flash, who was rebooted with a new costume, Captain America and Submariner they looked exactly the same. And they failed. They didn't sell well. So maybe that was the reason that they needed to be rebooted, not just brought back. So this is the way history happens. And so now when we look back as historians, the Silver Age, aka the 60s, didn't begin right at 1960, but we marked the beginning with the Flash as the first kind of new superhero, but he was a rebooted superhero. From 56, and then we go all the way through the 60s, and then there is some disagreement on when the Silver Age ends.
I always heard it was when Gwen Stacy died.
So one school of thought is 1983, when Gwen Stacy, who had been created by Spider-Man's creator Steve Ditko in 1965 or so. So in 1973, she was the first like kind of main character that was killed off, and not a hoax, not a dream, not an imaginary story. It was real. But I think 73 is too late to end the Silver Age because of the great comics that were happening in those early 70s. So I look at the year 1970 as the exact end of the Silver Age because there are 4 major events, not just one like Gwen Stacy. There are 4 major events in 1970 that all happen that make it the end of the Silver Age for at least me and other people who agree with me. Number 1, the editor of Superman comics, Mort Weisinger, who had been there for 30 years, retires. And that era of Superman is the TV show with George Reeves. It's the everything that the mainstream audience or people know about Superman came out of Mort Weisinger's worldview. So him leaving in 1970 marked the end of that Superman. And the Superman family of comics were the biggest sellers of comics. They outsold Marvel as well. Marvel didn't outsell DC until the mid 70s. So
man, I loved that old Superman cartoon that started off with him standing in front of the they tell the story of Superman. Krypton exploded and they show him, and then faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive. That was the best. My dad had that on VHS.
Now, those are the 1940s Max Fleischer cartoons. Those were made in the early 40s, right after Superman debuted. And Superman's original artist, Joe Shuster, actually did model sheets for the Fleischer animators, and that's why they look so much like the early Superman. But don't get me started talking about the Fleischer cartoons. We could spend the rest of the podcast talking about them. But
Okay.
but
Sorry.
no, but I forget where we were. But I think the other events in 1970 were Marvel Comics published. Well, the biggest event in 1970 that all by itself signals the end of the Silver Age really is Jack Kirby leaving Marvel, because the whole Marvel universe would not have happened without Jack Kirby. Yes, Stan Lee was a great editor. He dialogued Kirby's and the other artists' stories, but Kirby created all the characters and the foundation stories of the Marvel Comics universe. And all the movies they're making today are all because of Jack Kirby. So when he left
Ditko and Bill Everett,
Spider-Man and Doctor. Basically, without Ditko and Kirby, there would be no Marvel Comics as we know it. And when Kirby left in 1970, it was the equivalent of the Beatles breaking up in 1970. You know, that was such a momentous year in kind of artistic culture. But in comics, Kirby leaving Marvel and going to the rival DC was unprecedented because of Kirby's mammoth achievement in the Silver Age. The third incident was Marvel Comics published the first issue of Conan the Barbarian, which signaled the first non-superhero genre in mainstream comics to be successful. And you'd have to go back to The Flash in 1956 to see the introduction of a new genre. So Conan the Barbarian getting published in 1970. And the last major incident that I cover in my Silver Age book is the series Green Lantern, Green Arrow, illustrated by Neil Adams and written by Denny O'Neil, who was DC's hippest writer at the time. They were stories literally torn from the day's headlines. And because of Neil Adams' hyper-realistic style, the idea of superheroes existing in the real world, which is a concept now in our post-Watchmen world that we take for granted. There's TV shows now like The Boys that are about what if superheroes really existed. Well, the Green Lantern, Green Arrow,
show, by the way.
Brilliant.
Yeah,
I can't wait for season 2. But
right.
but Green Lantern, Green Arrow, even though it only lasted 13 issues from 70 to 72, was groundbreaking. And in fact, Alan Moore, living in England at the time, would not have gone on to do Miracle Man and Watchmen if it wasn't for the impact of those Green Lantern, Green Arrow comics. So those 4 incidents all happening in 1970, to me, signal an unarguable end to the Silver Age and the beginning of basically the 1970s.
Which a lot of people call the Bronze Age, or are we meddled out at this point? Or?
Yeah, because my feeling is only gold and silver makes sense because they're more familiar in the culture. We talk about golden anniversaries, silver anniversaries. To me, bronze has nothing to do with the 1970s. To me, once we get into the 70s, then I just call the ages of comics by the decades. Comics in the 70s, the 80s, 90s. Because, okay, after bronze, you know, what are the 80s, you know?
The aluminum age.
You know, it becomes, to me, bronze is as ridiculous. Only gold and silver. And, you know, silver makes sense also because of the alliteration with the 60s, you know, silver 60s. And because it came after the golden age, that's the only one that makes sense.
I understand. I get what you're saying. Cool. That is a lot of history, and it's a very rich history. And it's interesting hearing you talk about it because, you know, I love Marvel, I love DC, but I'm mainly a Marvel guy. I read a lot of Marvel comics and a few DC comics. So when I think of all these things, you know, when I'm thinking back to Golden Age, the first name that comes to my mind is Carlo Burgos or Bill Everett, the guys that wrote in Marvel Comics #1. And just hearing it from the DC perspective is very interesting, with Superman and everything. And when I think of the Silver Age, I think of Fantastic Four #1 with Jack and Stan.
Yep.
So yeah, it's
well,
crazy
you know,
how
and
much
it's
is actually happening.
you only know those things because of reprints. You're too young, obviously, to have experienced them when they came out. So, God bless reprints, number one. The fact that you even know the 1940s and the golden age is only through reprints. I was too young to experience the golden age. So the things that are coming out today that your generation is fortunate to have are these incredibly beautifully packaged reprints, these deluxe hardcovers, the artist editions, these giant size facsimile reproductions of the original art. Are you kidding me? If we had that when I was a kid, we would have died. So the things that you're lucky because of the printing techniques, digital printing, and everything that you're getting now, these beautiful editions. Like I said, we're living in a golden age, pun intended, right now. We've been living in it really for the last 40 years, since the 80s, since the birth of the comic book store. The wealth of incredible talent, characters, artists, writers, titles, the reproduction packages are, like I said, we've been a golden age of comics for 40 years now.
Nice. So I have to ask, if you could have 3 superpowers right now, what would they be?
Okay, number one, how can you not want to fly? I think flying is a natural human instinct. That's why, you got the Leonardo da Vinci flying machines. I mean, I think we all at one time or another, I think the essential appeal of Superman was the fact that he could fly, even though in the beginning he could only leap tall buildings in a single bound. But I think that is the essential thrill of superheroes mostly, even though Batman can't fly, but the way he swings across the sky,
he glides.
He's practicing.
He can glide.
Yeah. The point is I think after flight, everything else becomes pretty moot. If I just had the power of flight, I'd be a happy boy. After that, I don't know. I'd have to stop and think, what superpower would you want? I don't know.
I'd like to eat. I'd like to be able to eat as many burritos as I want without gaining any weight.
Yes.
Yeah.
Calorie man. Calorie. I'll have it on your desk by Monday morning.
Excellent. Hey, can you hold up that book? I saw you holding a book earlier. Let's take a look at that.
My book,
Huge.
Silver Age comic book art. It's the first book about the great art in comics, and a lot of the text, I take out the original balloons. Let me just find a page that I can show you. So you mentioned Jack Kirby. So, for instance, who does? He's the greatest.
I love the size of that book. I like a nice, huge book.
Yeah, 9 by 13. I wanted the art to be bigger than life. Hold on a second. Here we go. Okay, so in this spread of Kirby's Captain America, on the right-hand page, it looks like it's a single comic page, but it's not. That's made up. Each tier is from 3 different stories, but I graphically designed them to look like a single page. And then in the word balloons, which you probably can't read, I took out the original dialogue and I put Kirby from interviews talking about Captain America, saying how he choreographs fight scenes like violent ballets.
I love it. I love it. That's great stuff, man.
My book. So you read my book like a giant comic book, but it's an art book and a history book at the same time. So these are all Kirby's collages that I put together as one double-page spread, which he was famous for in the 60s, doing these photo collages. And then the dialogue in the word balloons is Kirby talking about how he came up with the ideas to do those collages, how he created the negative zone, which is the background image. So that's the beauty of my book, is that it's a history book, it's an art book, and it's like a giant comic book.
If I order one for you, are you going to sign it for me and make it out to my Aunt Petunia?
Right. If you go through my website, which is linked to my dedicated site, thesilverageofcomicbookart.com, you'll get the book directly from me. I'll sign it. I'll make a little drawing, a sketch in it that you'll love. And you'll be supporting your local artists instead of Amazon. no offense to Amazon, they're doing a beautiful job during this crisis, but support your local freelance artists.
Absolutely. We at IFLC 100% agree and support that. Let me ask you this. So, and my knowledge is significantly more limited, especially when it comes to like the older comics going back to the golden and silver ages. But would you say that even back in the day, comics have always sort of had a political undertone in one way or another? Would you say that's accurate, or
well,
how do you?
First of all, I would say all art, whether the artist is articulate enough to articulate it or not, all art is inherently political. And because artists are no different than, we're all regular people, we absorb ideas that are in the ether, even if we don't consciously or unconsciously are aware of it. So for instance, Joe Kubert, the great DC Comics war artist, in fact, I can probably open up the page, sweet, just to show you what I'm talking about. But this is, I think, a perfect example, is that in 1968, at the beginning of the Vietnam War protests, really, that was the big first year, Sgt Rock is a World War II character, but he has this stop the war, I want to get out. And it's about Sgt Rock wanting to quit the war. Now, even though it took place in World War II, I remember when I interviewed Kubert for the book, I said, Joe, you've got to tell me that when you did this comic with your writer partner, Bob Kanigher, that you weren't protesting the Vietnam War. And he said to me, Arlen, we weren't. We were just doing another Sgt Rock story about how war is hell. And I said to him, I said, Joe, just because you weren't consciously aware of it, I believe you unconsciously or subconsciously were reacting to what was happening. You couldn't deny in 1968 the political events that were happening, and somehow that made it into your work, whether you can articulate it or are aware of it or not. And that's why comics are no different than any other art forms. You've got writers and artists that are living in the real world, and they're coming up with stories and concepts and ideas that are part of, that's how artists create. They create from the world around them.
And it's of course that makes sense what you're saying. It makes sense, but in 2020, the internet, even the biggest shithead in the world has a voice now. Everybody's got a voice,
right?
And you can't have, it's like that's inherently true, but now it's like there's all these people. Every time anything comes out, there's all these people that are saying, "Hey, comics shouldn't be political," or "Take the politics out of comics," and it's like, where the fuck have you been for the last 80 years? You know what I mean?
Or how about the history of art? Again,
right.
Comics, it doesn't mean that everything created is, quote, political, but, the personal is political. Artists put themselves in their art, again, whether they know it or not, whether they're conscious of it or not. Jack Kirby once said in an interview, every character I created is me. Now, he's created some great female characters. They're still him. The artist can't help but put himself into the things he creates. Again, it's his worldview. I mentioned Mort Weisinger before. Mort Weisinger did not write a single story for Superman. He was the editor. But his worldview, the way he saw the world, and this is just from research I've done on Weisinger, the way Weisinger saw the world was unique to him. And somehow that worldview made it into these Superman stories that were written by writers and drawn by artists. But Weisinger got his worldview in there, again, consciously sometimes, unconsciously other times, and subconsciously. And that is the way art is done. Now, sometimes it's sort of sideways. So in other words, the very first title page in my book is Gil Kane's The Atom in his civilian identity as Ray Palmer. Okay, this is 1961. Now, why did I choose it to be the title page? Because to me, this image represents the early 60s, which, if you know your history, was pre-Vietnam. It was an optimistic era. Science and technology were going to take us to the moon. Now, the artist and the writer that came up with this in 1961, they were not necessarily aware of what they were creating at the time, but I think they were. They knew that the atom represented the atomic age and this positive view to the future. But then you turn the page of my book and you get the second title page, which is from the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series of a Christ-like protester in 1972 chaining himself to an SST plane. Now, in the real world, the reason why there are no SSTs in America is because protesters in 1971 shut it down because of the pollution it would cause. So remember I said the Green Lantern, Green Arrow series were torn from the day's headlines. So Adams and O'Neill do a story about that. But when I look at the image, it also represents the death of the 60s. So if you notice, the atom is ghosted behind all the copyright language on the left-hand page. And now I'm basically saying to you, the viewer, this is the story of the Silver Age. How did we get from the image of positivity to this image of the death of the 60s, the end of the era? And I go through the book basically explaining that.
The party followed by the hangover.
Exactly. And that's what happened in the 60s. That's how the 60s ended.
So my partner Robo has been watching while we've been having this conversation, and I think he wants to come in and ask you a couple questions himself.
How
dare he, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Does he have written permission?
Yeah, right. He's got to sign the waiver. He should pop up on the screen any moment now.
What's up, guys? So I'm sitting here. What's going on, Arlen? I'm sitting here listening to you guys work your magic, and I'm just like in the background, like let me in. This is it. This is what I want. Like, did someone say politics? So I did have a question, just to jump right into it. You've talked a lot about the politics, and you talked about like what that means in comics for the Silver Age. I know
art in general.
Yeah, and art in general.
I didn't talk about the creation of Black Panther by Jack Kirby. Nice Jewish boy named Yaakov Kurtzberg creates the greatest black superheroic icon in the middle of the 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about politics.
That's right. So one of the things that in Judith kind of touched on it before with regard to everyone has a voice now. One of the things that you see today is that kind of voice of, don't push your agenda down my throat and all this stuff. But you showed a really powerful image there of stop the war. Now, when people were allowed to talk, or like maybe I'd imagine probably in the Silver Age, probably more along conventions and clubs and get-togethers. Were people complaining about those images? I mean, clearly there had to have been people who supported the Vietnam War when they saw anti-war images in comic books. Was there a conventional comic book? Conservative comic book fan that are like, I hate this. I hate what the X-Men are doing. I hate what Captain America's doing for Vietnam.
I would imagine you'd have to go back and see in the letters columns.
Yeah.
I would imagine. Listen, during the whole, people think the 60s were, the counterculture and all the protests. Well, there was also this thing called the silent majority.
There you go. Yeah.
And there were plenty of conservative. Listen, that's how Nixon got elected in '68. I remember seeing Ken Burns's documentary on the 60s, which was brilliant, or it was on the Vietnam War a year or two ago. And it pointed out that after every single protest in the media between the hippies and the protesters and the pro-Vietnam forces, and sometimes it was construction workers, cops, you name it, the day after they took a poll, the majority of Americans were against the protesters. They were for the war. And so this idea that the 60s were all about free love, there was always the silent majority. And
which is how anytime would go, right?
But their children are the 63 million Americans that voted for Trump. Sorry to have to bring that subject up.
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's a painful topic still. But yeah, I wonder though, in part of, so as we start trying to digest what is going on with print media and what is the life cycle of print media and comic books in general, a lot of times what we see going on in the world of Twitter and whatnot is, the reason why it's failing is because of this or because of that, because you're trying to push this agenda. But we saw the exact opposite happened in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, where we saw superheroes taking on social issues, but it was a booming era, right? And so you said it yourself, that the silent majority, plenty of conservatives were like, if you are against the war, you must be for communism. So you're a pink Ogami, right? And so that's how, and so nothing's new, right? But we didn't see a hurt on comics for that, or was there? Was that a detriment to comics in the 70s and 80s?
No, because I think the powers of censorship were not strong in the 60s because it was such a flowering of creativity, even though I'm sure, listen, on television, because of the Vietnam War and violence, it killed all those Saturday morning superhero cartoons. They all died out by 1970. It killed shows like The Wild Wild West, which you can see in reruns now. But that was a top-rated show in 1968.
You mean with Will Smith?
No.
Very funny. The TV show that was based on, very funny. But that TV show was successful in the ratings, but it was taken off the air because of all the protests about violence on television, which again is one of the unfortunate fallouts from the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War single-handedly killed a lot of American pop culture because of the nature of the war and how it was shown in the media. And those groups that were against violence, those are the same groups, that we're still dealing with today.
Sure.
But the bottom line is, the 60s themselves are still being debated, 50, 60 years later for both its good points and its bad points. But I'd like to think that more good came out of the 60s, especially creatively, than so-called negative stuff. To me, the conservative forces have succeeded in recasting the Vietnam War as this noble effort. Are you kidding me? I was 10 years old at the time, and even I knew that the Vietnam War was bullshit. And that if I were old enough to be drafted, I would have been on a train to Canada, toot sweet.
That's right.
So this idea,
unless you had enough money,
like that, if you were a resistor, like you should have, gone to Vietnam. Screw you. And by the way, everything that the counterculture said about the government and about Vietnam ended up being proven true.
That's right.
That Vietnam was bullshit. And how ironic that everything, just like the Black Lives Matter movement, because of the growth of video cameras, everything they've been complaining about for decades,
proven true.
That the cops planted drugs on people, that they, faked murders to look like, the guy was running away. Well, now that we have video, we can see, guess what? They were right.
Yeah.
So pretty much everything that the left wing, that the counterculture protested against, basically came true.
I love that you're saying this, because one of the things that you hear a lot. Sorry, Judah. 1 second. One of the things you hear a lot is that fact that, like, nothing new, right? Nothing news under the sun. So real quick, with regard to what you said about the cops, one thing I hear a lot that it's so true is, if you're paying attention to news media, is the problem. Insert problem here. It doesn't even matter what we're talking about. The problem isn't new. The cameras are new. And the information superhighway brings us all to light what people have been dealing with for 50, 60, 70, 100 years. But now we have Facebook and Twitter. It's like, hey, this is funny. Like, oh my God, the 2020s are crazy. Like, no, this has been happening forever. Go ahead, Judah. Go ahead. You wanted to say something.
No, and that's the whole,
Yeah, I'm just trying to circle it back around to, I guess, superheroes and shit.
I forgot this is a comic book show. That's right.
Why didn't I tell you how Black Panther was created? Because that was totally political. You know, the reason why he's got a full face mask is to hide the fact that he's black.
All right.
Because in 1966, Southern distributors were not going to put out comics with a black superhero on the cover.
Yeah.
Kirby's original design, which I show in my lectures, of the Black Panther in 1965, a year before he's premieres in Fantastic Four, was of a kind of a black version of Superman, fully exposed face. He looked like Obama as a superhero.
Wow.
And he was called the Coal. He was called the Coal Tiger, Coal, because Black Panthers in Africa were probably called coal tigers because they were black as coal.
I love that name.
Wow.
That's so
Yeah,
badass.
the Coal Tiger. Then there's an infamous rejected cover of Fantastic Four 52, which debuted the Black Panther, and it shows the Black Panther as you know him in his black costume, except he's got a half mask like Batman. So you could see that he is a Negro, as they were called back then.
Right.
Well, guess what? That got rejected. And you have, when Black Panther debuts, a total face mask. So when I lectured on the Black Panther recently, I pointed out how, you know how all of these people are protesting sports mascots as being racist, like the Redskins, and the grinning Oriental of the Cleveland Indians with the buck teeth. I'm not Oriental, but you know what I mean. The buck-toothed Indian of the Cleveland Indians. Well, I find it ironic that the coolest, hippest black superhero, Black Panther, created by a Jew named Yaakov Kurtzberg, probably because of the 1964 civil rights murders of the three guys in Mississippi. One was black and two were white Jews from Boston, Schwerner and Goodman. And then in 1965, you have the Watts riots. Yeah. Kirby was up on what was happening. So he basically said, you know, I have all these black readers and I don't have a black superhero.
Right.
So he creates Black Panther, but without a mask. So isn't it funny? And I use the word funny in quotes. Here we are 60 years later, and the Black Panther's full face mask, even though it looks cool, is as racist as the Ku Klux Klan hood, because that mask is only there to disguise that he's black.
Because the black face of the character wouldn't get past. Okay, yeah, that's
exactly
that's super interesting.
You know, I've never thought about it that way, but that is interesting. That's definitely an interesting
point. And I remember
point.
When I lectured that a couple of years ago, you know, black man in the audience, you know, got very angry. Like, are you saying that the Black Panther is no different than the Ku Klux Klan? I'm saying no. What I am saying is that as cool as that mask is, I don't understand that it is as racist a mask as
because of all the steps that you had to go through. All the editors goes, we don't want to show. How do we show a black dude doing something without showing it? Yeah.
To be a fully exposed black man. And if you notice in the movie they made, the character playing the Black Panther, you know, he goes around the whole movie without that mask on, pretty much.
That's right.
Once in a while, he puts the mask on.
Yeah. So and it's more like for armor or something.
That was Kirby's intention.
Yeah.
You know?
That's
good
stuff.
That's what I find interesting about the Black Panther in terms of politics. Oh, and by the way, he was created 6 months before the Black Panther Party. So I point out in my lectures that the Black Panther Party, when they were asked how did they come up with their name, they didn't give credit to Jack Kirby, because in 1966, you're looking for respect from the media. Comics were looked down upon. You're not going to say, oh, yeah, we came up with the name because of this cool comic book character. They claim they got the name Black Panther from a 1964 voting rights organization in Alabama, which used the Black Panther as a symbol to offset this white rooster racist symbol for white power.
Sure.
And they got that Black Panther from Clark University in Atlanta, whose sports mascot was the Black Panthers. But what I point out in my lectures is that Kirby fought in World War II with Patton. And Patton had a segregated black tank crew that they called the Black Panthers.
Oh, wow. That all comes together.
That is where Kirby got the name Black Panther from. Even though we don't have documented evidence, he never says that in an interview. To me, we as historians, we put together the clues that were given. And to me, it's undeniable that Kirby came up with Black Panther because of the segregation.
Yeah, you can't help but make some inferences. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
You know what's interesting is all these Jews created all these superheroes going back to the 40s, but we didn't get an openly Jewish superhero until Kitty Pryde in the 1980s with Chris Claremont.
Mm-hmm. You know, Neil Gabler, the great writer, wrote a book called Hollywood and the Jews or something like that. And the bottom line is what he pointed out. Remember, I said comics and movies are both immigrant Jewish American art forms. All the early Hollywood moguls were Jewish. Mm-hmm. They were all immigrants from Russia and from Eastern Europe that came over in the early part of the 20th century. Most East Coast American Jews, we all come from Eastern Europe and Russia, and we all came over. And then they left New Jersey where the film started, and they went to Hollywood because the films were being controlled by the criminal gangs. So to escape the criminal gangs, the Jews fled to California.
It wasn't because of the smell of Newark, or...
Hey, I grew up in New Jersey.
Oh, sorry.
But anyway, the point is comics were, again, Jews were not allowed to participate. If you notice, all the newspaper comic artists were not Jews. Alex Raymond, Chester Gould, Hal Foster, the great gods of newspaper comics were not Jews, because newspapers were a respectable, higher-paying medium, and Jews weren't allowed in there. So comics were this gutter medium, just like films were considered gutter entertainment for the immigrant masses. Sure. The original Nickelodeons were for the immigrants because it was just pictures. Remember, they were silent movies. So the point is comics were also considered immigrant trash. They came out of the pulps. They came out of the original comic book publishers who were publishing porn magazines, and they switched over to comics. So the young Jews of the day, they went into comics because they couldn't get into newspapers. So Siegel and Schuster, Bob Kane changed his name from Kahn to Kane. Jack Kirby was Yaakov Kurtzberg. Joe Simon, who co-created Captain America. I mean, Kirby and Simon, a.k.a. Yaakov Kurtzberg and Jaime Simon, in 1941, a year before America enters the war, create the ultimate American icon superhero, Captain America, to raise the consciousness of America, which at the time was isolationist. They didn't want to fight what was called Europe's war, they certainly weren't to fight a war to save the Jews. So what did two Jews that were creating, superheroes in the early 40s come up with? They come up with Captain America.
Which is
it's the ultimate Gentile assimilated icon that Jews wanted to be. They were supposed to assimilate. Don't make waves. Keep your head down. So the reason why, and this is mimicked in movies and television, they're Jewish themes. The idea of the American dream, which we've gotten through Hollywood, about the little guy standing up against the big guy, the Frank Capra films, all of those ideas are Jewish ideas, Judeo-Christian, whatever you want to call it. But these very ideas that were adopted as the American dream is actually a Jewish American dream of being an immigrant and coming to make it in the land of the free. That was basically a Jewish American idea. And it took hold in Hollywood. It took hold in comics. It took hold in television. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, talk about going from the sacred to the profane. But do you know the origin of the show about the kid that gets in trouble in Philadelphia? The black kid goes to Beverly Hills and he lives with a wealthy black family in Beverly Hills. Well, you know what the real creation story is? Everything was right up until he goes to Beverly Hills and he lives with a white Jewish family. So the creators of the show, they couldn't even be true to life. They had to change it. So Jews have always created American culture. Irving Berlin wrote White Christmas, for Christ's sake.
Just at the risk of tiptoeing into a dangerous stereotype here, it's actually pretty it's actually pretty genius on a capitalist business like level, because when you look at the demographics of the 50s and 60s, if they sat there and the great grandfathers of comic books decided to, you know what, we're gonna make it our own, and we're gonna make them Jewish characters, and we're gonna move to Hollywood, and we're gonna make TV about Jewish stories and Jewish characters. At the time, and still to the majority, but at the time, the white Anglo-Saxons. No, absolutely.
Listen, are you kidding me? Look at Seinfeld. Julie Louis-Dreyfus is Jewish, but she plays Elaine Bennis, who is not Jewish on the show.
Yeah.
George Costanza is Jason Alexander. His parents, they're all Jews.
Yes.
They talk like all of my Jewish relatives.
Yeah.
And yet on the show, he's Costanza. Okay?
Wow.
So the point is
wait, George is not Jewish on the show? I thought he was Jewish on the show, but you're right, Costanza.
He's Italian.
Costanza ain't no Jewish
name.
Why didn't they hire...
He celebrates Festivus.
Exactly.
Festivus for the rest
no,
of
but
us.
my point is that Larry David and Seinfeld are Jewish, and yet even on the show, they change the character. But they act Jewish. They talk. This is what I'm saying. All along, the Jewishness can't help but be in the creations.
That's right.
It's just that Jews were told, you got to assimilate. You got to go along to get along. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Because the anti-Semitism in this country and in the world is right under the skin like the cellophane wrapper of a Kraft single. All you have to do is peel it off, and it's right there. The black anti-Semitism in this country breaks my heart, because that's a thing, black anti-Semitism. And that exists because the landlords in the slums who are Jewish, they weren't allowed to own land like their wealthy Gentile peers. They were given the crap properties. So that created black anti-Semitism, which exists to this day. But if blacks knew the history of the civil rights movement, it wouldn't have happened without Jewish involvement, both financially and philosophically. So I do a lecture called Jews and Comics as well. It's on, when you go to my website, it's linked to my YouTube channel, and it's a lecture you can see right there. But, you know, this is the history of the Jewish people. Look, we gave the world Jesus Christ. We gave the pagan world God through Christ, and look at the grief we've gotten because of it. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And by the way, I also do a lecture called Christ in Comics, where I show how even though it was mostly created by Jews, all the superheroes have a Christological nature to them. This idea of sacrificing themselves to save the people they love or the universe or mankind. There's a whole slew of incredible stories that I show in my lecture that are basically Christological reflections. But listen, the story of Christ was created by Jews as well. So it all ties in.
Bingo. So real quick, I'm going to try to read Judah's brain real quick. As we approach the close of this has been awesome, and let me tell you.
I told you, man, we barely scratched the surface.
So I think you're right. We're gonna have to do a part 2 if you would be willing. That'd be awesome to bring this on again. But I did want to.
3, 4, 5, 6. No,
I did want to ask you a quick question. So you said that you worked with Neil Adams before, right? Is that correct? Did I hear you right? Yeah. So I'm sure you have a lot of history. If you wanted to, in your early days of art, when you're working with the like I call them the grandfathers of comic books, as you're coming up, as a young man, what would you say? What artist or creator or writer that you've worked with, do you have like any kind of like funny stories or anecdotes about somebody like, hey, you know what? A lot of people like this guy, but he turns out this way. Or the opposite. A lot of people didn't like this guy, but I worked with him and he's actually this and that.
Well, I think the best story I have, and it's only because, Judah, you mentioned Jim Steranko. Now, Jim Steranko.
My man.
Okay, so Jim Steranko, when I say him and Neil Adams were the twin gods of comic book art in the late 60s. they were like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, or later on, like Alan Moore and Neil Gaiman, like two incredible, great people right at the same time. So flash forward, I'm in art school, Rhode Island School of Design, majoring in graphic design in the late 70s. And I must have written a fanboy letter to Steranko telling him that I'm majoring in graphic design, which is the mixture of words and pictures, which is what comics are. It's what print advertising was back when there was print advertising. And our whole culture is words and pictures. And that's what attracted me about graphic design. So I must have written Steranko a fanboy letter saying that you're the reason, because there was so much graphic design in his work. When you examine his incredible work in the late 60s, it's the mixture of words and pictures, the way he treated type and things like that. And he wrote me back a letter inviting me to come to Reading, Pennsylvania to interview with him. Now, I'm a junior at RISD, major in graphic design. I got one more year to go to graduate. But I remember taking a bus from Providence, Rhode Island to Reading, Pennsylvania. And I spent the whole day with Steranko. I showed him my portfolio. I don't remember
awesome.
anything about the day. You know why? Because I think I was having a Doctor Strange ectoplasmic out-of-body experience.
Yeah.
Because I was sitting in Steranko's, penthouse studio home in Reading, Pennsylvania. But
Amazing.
what I do remember is that he wanted me to leave RISD and come to Reading to work for him as his apprentice.
The answer is yes.
So, I remember going on the bus back to Providence, like the last scene of The Graduate, which is, them going off on that bus with their life in front of them, the heavy metaphor of, the road and the journey. And which way do I go? Do I stay in school and get my degree? I only had, remember, a year and a half to go. Or do I leave school and join the circus, a.k.a. become Steranko's apprentice? So what do you think I did?
I want to say that you became Steranko's apprentice, please. Say that that's what you did.
Bro, what do you think I did?
I think you stayed in school.
My mother, may she rest in peace, she put me through school with her own money. Might have had some student loans. I don't remember. But, maybe had this been freshman year, I might have left school. But I was already in my junior year. I wasn't going to leave school. I felt I owed it to my mother, literally, to stay in school. And I loved my time at RISD. It's a great art school. Providence was a great town. But so I ended up staying in school, but I've maintained my friendship with Jim Steranko to this day. We email each other every now and then. I see him at conventions. So, and then, of course, a couple of years later, I ended up working for the other god of comics, Neil Adams. So I'm very lucky and very blessed that I think I'm very unique that I can say out of the entire generation who came of age with me, where Steranko and Adams were the twin gods, I'm probably the only one who can say I not only worked for one of them, but I almost worked for the other one.
That's right.
And for that reason, like I said, I'm pretty blessed. And their influence is in every line I draw, every word I write. I mean, Steranko was a great prose writer, and his volumes on the history of comics, which were about the golden age, were an influence on me to do the book on the Silver Age.
That's awesome.
Neil Adams, art.
That is awesome.
When people look at my artwork, my illustration, and I get compliments like, "Oh, I thought that was Neil Adams." Are you kidding me? Again, if you had told me at 12 years old, when I was struggling to make my art look like Neil Adams, if you had told me, Arlen, don't worry, one day people are going to be looking at your artwork and comparing it to Neil Adams, I would have had a heart attack and died.
That's right.
Right there.
So
I'm very lucky and very blessed that it all kind of turned out that way.
So before we cut this, before we say goodbye for the time being, can you tell us a little bit about your webinar that's going to be on Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah. So I hooked up with this company in New York City called New York Adventure Club, which used to do in-person live meetup events like walking tours of New York City. But because of the coronavirus, all that had to be shut down. So the guy running it had to switch to webinars. So he was talking to a friend of mine in New York City who's a Frank Sinatra expert, and he said, we need people who are very visual, because webinars, you got to show images.
Yeah.
Well, my friend Will Friedland said, visual, you got to give Arlen Schumer a call. So beginning with April 1st, my lectures, which are on my YouTube channel, are very easily translatable to webinars, because basically you just take the lecture, which is like a PowerPoint file, you make a PDF out of it, and you show the images. So the format of the webinar is a natural for me. So April 1st, I did one based on the Silver Age book. Then I did on Passover, Jews and comics. On Easter, I did Christ and comics. The one coming up tomorrow is on the relationship between fine art and comic art, which I really love, because laymen, people that don't necessarily know comics, but they're visually literate, are going to love this one, because I compare and contrast great comic art with many modern masters and the Renaissance masters and everything in between. Then next week, on the 29th, I'm going to be doing my first one on the Twilight Zone, which is like another metaphorical creative child of mine. I've done the only coffee table art book about the Twilight Zone. Again, if you go to my website, there's a Twilight Zone icon. You click on that, you'll see the creative works that I've done based on the series.
And we'll make sure we have all those links in our video description here to make sure we get people to watch us to that.
Before we move on, just really quick, what's your favorite Twilight Zone episode?
Well, it's got to be Eye of the Beholder, about the woman getting plastic surgery, and all during the episode, you don't see the doctors' faces, and then at the end, she's beautiful. She's Daisy May from the Beverly Hillbillies, Donna Douglas, and then you see the doctors and nurses, and they're these incredible. I mean, if you saw that episode when you were a kid, whether it's in reruns or originally broadcast, that burns its way into your cortex. You can never forget it. Even though in polls now, because of Facebook, you know, I'm part of all these hazard groups. To Serve Man, Time Enough at Last, they usually outrank Eye of the Beholder. But there's something about Eye of the Beholder, because the director couldn't show the doctors and nurses' faces throughout the whole half hour. The episode is choreographed almost like a ballet, and very creative. I mean, it's such a unique work of television art, and I mean that seriously. For the medium of television, there's nothing like Eye of the Beholder. And, you know, the message is very political, both for its time. It was a veiled allegory to the civil rights movement, where she was like the black person that they wanted to segregate with people of her own kind. But it's universal, because it's about the individual in society. We are all Janet Tylers with bandages wrapped around us, that society wants us to fit in with everybody. But we can only become who we really are when we unwrap those bandages.
And you see how ugly everyone else is.
Great art is both of its time and timeless. And that's why the Twilight Zone. And in my webinar, I show how so many episodes are prescient about the crisis we're going through right now. So many Twilight Zone episodes were about isolation, loneliness, solitude. And I'll be discussing those. And then Wednesday, May 6th, I'll do my first webinar on the career of Bruce Springsteen as shown through his greatest videos. So that's my third metaphorical creative child. I've done a lot of works on Bruce Springsteen's career as well.
Okay. So it's going to be an exciting. It's going to be an exciting month, though. So this week we got fine arts and comics. Next week we got the Twilight Zone. After that we got Bruce Springsteen. Sounds like a party.
Yeah, you got it, man.
So,
and
hey,
it's all about love. I love them all.
I want to thank you for coming here and talking to us. You're very passionate and enthusiastic, and it was really fun and inspiring. So thanks a lot, and we're going to talk and see if we can drag you back on the show again sometime.
Drag me back. Hold me back. I might have to come to Hawaii and barge right in and be on your podcast. But listen, all kidding aside, it's really been an honor and a privilege. So thanks for having me on your show. And like I said, I love freaking comics. Well, so do I.
You freaking love comics.
I freaking love comics.
Hey, so everything for those of home watching, everything that he's talked about, all his webinars, all his websites, that to go buy his book. I asked you to go buy that. The links you'll find in the description. We'll also have a link to buy tickets to his webinar that he has tomorrow. Arlen Schumer, thanks again for coming on. Can't wait to have you on again.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's been a pleasure. I hope it was as good for you as it was for me.
It was good. I'm going to go smoke a cigarette after this.